Okay, these are your Chapter 3, Section 3 through 5 notes. So Chapter 3, Section 3, what happens to energy in an ecosystem? Well, energy flows through an ecosystem. So as energy flows in the food chains and the food webs and the actual chemical cycles, it goes from one level to the next. And so food chains are the movement of energy and nutrients from one trophic level to the next. And so if you think about it, plants get their energy from the sun and photosynthesis, and then they are fed upon by primary consumers, and then they are waste products in decomposition, and then those nutrients then go back into new plants. So a food web is just a more complicated version of this because you have a network of interconnected food chains. So here's a basic food chain. First trophic level would be your producers, and they get their energy from the sun. And then it goes to the caterpillar who eats the plants, and then the robin who eats the caterpillar, and the hawk who eats the robin. And through every one of these steps, most of the energy is getting lost as heat or through metabolic processes and wastes, and then those wastes are fed on by decomposers and detritivores. Now here's a food web, which is, as you can see, far more complicated because all of these organisms don't just eat one thing, they can eat many things. So the squid can be eaten by a penguin or a leopard seal or an elephant seal or a killer whale or a sperm whale. And so because it is so interconnected and complicated, a food web is much more indicative of what an ecosystem really looks like. Okay, so as you go through each trophic level, you lose energy that's usable. And so that's why we were calculating biomass in our owl pellet lab, because biomass is the dry weight of all the organic matter in each given trophic level in a food chain or a food web. And so as you go higher up, you're going to lose a lot of that energy. Please excuse the bell. So the pyramid of energy flow shows the 10% rule. 90% of energy is lost in each transfer. And so the less chemical energy for higher trophic levels, which makes sense. So we start with the producers. Let's say they have 10,000 kilocalories of energy, and then they're taken in by the primary consumers, which are zooplankton. They get 10% of that, 1,000. And then secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. And most of this energy is being lost as heat or waste or through metabolism, and the decomposers are taking up what is left over, and they are then also losing energy in the form of heat. And so some ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others do. And we call this production of plant matter their gross primary productivity. So it's the rate at which they can actually take solar energy and convert it to chemical energy and biomass. And it's measured by kilocalories per meter squared per year. Now, plants also have to use some of their energy in the form of cellular respiration because, for example, deciduous trees lose their leaves in the winter. They need to have some energy to keep them alive. And so we take the gross primary productivity and we subtract that energy that they use, and we get our net primary productivity. So what's actually available and out there in the form of energy. And so different ecosystems are going to have different amounts of net primary productivity. And so here's a lovely chart that goes through both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And as you can see, swamps and marshes and tropical rainforests have the highest NPP. No surprise there. They have lots of plants and lots of organic matter, and so their NPP is very high. In the ocean, it's estuaries, because estuaries, again, have a large amount of plankton and phytoplankton, and also a large amount of plants. Okay, so now Chapter 3, Section 4, what happens to matter in an ecosystem? Well, it comes in the form of nutrients, and it cycles among the ecosystem and the biosphere, and obviously humans are altering these chemical cycles. So we're going to talk about these in a lot more detail in class, but these are the nutrient cycles we're going to go through. We're going to go through the hydrologic, or the water cycle, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And one thing you have to notice about these cycles is sometimes they are not entirely continuous. Nutrients can remain stored for a long period of time. So think of something like phosphorus being stored in rocks, which are then covered in dirt. And so they're still part of the cycle, but they may not be accessed. And so let's start with the water cycle. I'm not going to sing you the stupid song, but you have evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and then transpiration by plants, which is very important because plants hold water and then release it slowly. Okay, and so humans are obviously altering the hydrologic cycle in a number of different ways. We are withdrawing large amounts of fresh water, and so think back to the tragedy of the commons. We are taking fresh water much faster than nature can refilter and replace it. We're also clearing vegetation, which is causing a decrease in the amount of transpiration that's occurring. And by clearing and draining wetlands, we're causing increased flooding because those wetlands are made to absorb that rainfall very quickly. Okay, and so here's a good picture of the hydrologic cycle. You'll notice that human impacts are in red, and natural processes are in powder blue. And so you can see how human intervention is changing the way the hydrologic cycle is working in particular areas. And just as a quick review of water, don't forget that water is really important because of the hydrogen bonding that occurs between water molecules. So it allows it to be liquid over a large temperature range. It changes temperature very slowly. It can absorb and retain a lot of heat. It has a high boiling point. Adhesion and cohesion are very important in the water cycle. It also expands as it freezes, which makes the icebergs, which will flow on top of salt water. It's also a solvent. A lot of things dissolve in water, and it filters out harmful UV radiation. Okay, so here's a good picture of the water molecule and how it has hydrogen bonds by the slightly negative end of the oxygen being attracted to the slightly positive end of the hydrogen. The next cycle we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. It's based off of carbon dioxide, and I apologize because I think I wrote this backwards. Oh, yes, I totally did. Okay, so producers remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then consumers use the oxygen released by the producers, and then they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere for the producers to use. I apologize, that third bullet I wrote backwards. And so sometimes carbon takes a long time to recycle because it's being stored in things like fossil fuels. And that's one of the ways that humans alter the carbon cycle. By burning fossil fuels, we're releasing that stored carbon back into the atmosphere at a much faster rate than it was put away. And also by deforestation, so we are carbon is stored obviously in trees and plants because they're organic, and when we have slash and burn agriculture and when we have decomposition, we release again a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. And here's a lovely example of the carbon cycle, and so you can see in red are ways that humans are releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is almost entirely bacteria-based, either regular bacteria or cyanobacteria as found in the oceans, and it's got three big steps. And the first is nitrogen fixation. So it takes nitrogen out of the air and it turns it into ammonia or some kind of ammonium ions. Okay, and so these are in different forms. And so think of wastes have high ammonia contents. And so now that it's in this different form, we're going to go through a process called nitrification. So they're going to take that ammonia and they're going to convert it to a nitrate, okay, which instead of having hydrogens now has oxygens, as you can see. And so now those nitrates are going to be used by other bacteria in a process called denitrification. And it's going to take those nitrate ions and it's going to convert it back to nitrogen gas. So we're going back out into the atmosphere for the whole glorious process to start again. Now, humans are altering this nitrogen cycle by collecting the nitrogen and using it to produce fertilizers. And those fertilizers are obviously then being spread on the earth and then introducing nitrogen back into the environment. We are also adding nitrous oxides into the atmosphere by burning fuels at very high temperatures. Jet engines and car engines are releasing NO into the atmosphere. And we'll talk more about nitrogen oxides, which we call NOx, when we talk about acid rain as well. Okay, so here's a lovely picture. I also forgot to mention that a natural pathway to get nitrogen into other forms is by lightning, electrical storms. Okay, so as you can see, humans are affecting it specifically by fertilizer and by burning fuel and, again, mining and fertilizer production. Okay, phosphorus cycle. This is going through water, the Earth's crust, and living organisms. So we're looking at geology, hydrology, and organic organisms. And so we are altering this cycle as well by clearing out the forests, which are holding phosphorus. We're also removing it from the earth in mining to create fertilizers. And when we erode the land and we get rid of that soil cover, we're exposing rocks, which also have phosphorus in them, which then dissolves into the water when it rains. And so here's a lovely picture of phosphates from sewage, from mining waste, from fertilizers, all running off back into the water. Okay, the sulfur cycle is new. We haven't done the sulfur cycle before. Most sulfur is found in rocks and sediments under the ocean. We're also going to get sulfur out of volcanoes in the form of sulfur oxides. We're going to talk a lot more about these. We call them SOx. I just talked to you about NOx. When we burn sulfur-containing coal and oil, we release sulfur into the environment, and then it's going to go up into the clouds, and we're going to form acid rain. It also happens when we burn other sulfur-containing petroleum products, as well as through mining, where metallic ores contain some sulfur as well. And so here's another picture of the sulfur cycle and how it is both naturally and non-naturally being processed through. All right, so Chapter 3, Section 5, how do scientists study ecosystems? Well, there's a bunch of different ways, but typically the three big ones are field research out in the ecosystem, lab research in a lab somewhere, or mathematical modeling. And so to study nature directly, we're going to do field research. We're going to go out into nature. We're going to observe, we're going to measure, and there's all sorts of fun technologies available. There are sensors, there's topographical maps and geography.
Mary Cronin to room 325, please. Mary Cronin to room 325.
And then there's also digital satellite imaging. And so in this case, they can look from satellites or even from drones and determine the fate of particular ecosystems based on what they see. To study ecosystems in a lab, they typically take a part of the ecosystem, bring it under laboratory conditions, and study it. So, for example, to determine what it takes to have coral bleaching occur, they may bring in coral and experiment with the water temperature or pH or salinity to see what exactly is happening that's making coral bleach. These are very simplified systems because they don't take into account all the other things going on in the environment. And these are also supported by some kind of field research. So the field research and the lab research should back each other up. Okay. We also use models to simulate ecosystems, so mathematical models, computer models, and this is a lot of what we're doing when we look at global warming data or data on polar ice caps, that kind of things. So you obviously need some kind of field and lab research as baseline data to then go in and produce a model off it. Okay, now why do we need to do this research? We need to do it to determine what condition the world's ecosystems are currently in and what needs to be done to improve them or if they're okay. And so obviously baseline data is definitely needed in order to be able to take it this step further to determine what needs to be done in the future. Okay, so 3 big ideas from Chapter 3, some of which you touched on in your previous set of notes, some of which I just did. Life is sustained by the flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere. and nutrients are cycled within the biosphere. We also obviously need gravity to keep all of this in a cycle so that when, for example, nitrogen turns back into a gaseous form, it stays within the atmosphere and doesn't float away, so it's not lost. Energy. Some organisms produce the nutrients they need. These are our producers. Some consume from others. Those are our consumers. And then we have our fun little decomposers who live on the wastes. Humans mess up all the cycles. Okay, so we're altering our cycles through the flow of energy through food chains and food webs, and the cycling of nutrients within ecosystems and the biosphere. And those are your notes.